Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I would like to present another layout design. And this design presentation is slightly unusual in that I don't usually present designs that I don't get to finish. A fair few of my layout design customers elect to only go through phase one or the rough design of the layout. And that's not a problem, although I always like to complete the designs. My contract does specifically make provision for them to do just phase one of the process. And this was one of those cases. However, in this case, I feel that there is quite a lot of worthwhile information to be passed on and things that can be learned from this design process. The plan is for an HO scale layout. Now, although the client's basement is quite large, he only wanted to use a relatively small portion of it for the railroad. Here is an accurate plan of the alcove that he has earmarked for the railroad. The largest rectangular area is round about 11 feet by 15, with about a 2-foot deep alcove over half of its length. Now, most of the rest of the basement is used up for storage, and he has a lot of floor-to-ceiling storage racks. This is his desk and spray booth area, and at the moment he has a seating area, table and chairs in this area. Now, the client was more into train watching than into switching, and he had a fair number of big 6-axle diesels that he wanted to run in tandem with some decent length trains. Now, the client had already spent some considerable time attempting to design a railroad in this area, but he was struggling to come up with anything that worked. He had curves that were too sharp, aisles that were too narrow. He had 2 levels of track that were not connected, because although he wanted some elevation change, he hadn't figured out how to connect it. And also everything he had drawn ended up being too much of a spaghetti bowl for his likes. So that's why he came to me. Now, he's more into watching trains run through dioramas than he is into intricate switching, although he wanted to do some switching. And he asked for a predominantly double-track mainline. This first sketch that I drew puts a few double-track loops in, just showing how much space they'll take up with a 30-inch radius on the inside, which I suggested as being a good minimum radius for his big diesels. Now, 36 inches is probably better, but it really didn't look as though we were going to have space for that. And at some points during the process, even 30 inches seemed like a tall order. For this first plan, I was trying to arrange for a folded dog bone. Circle A is one obvious endpoint, and circle B is another. I tried to extend it back into the main portion of the railroad again, but clearly there is nowhere near enough space to do so, because there's basically just no room for an aisle. So it didn't look like a folded dog bone was going to provide any kind of worthwhile railroad, because all you've really got is just a curve in this corner and very little straight track. Just ignore this small circle. It's not so much an obstruction as a point of the basement floor that we really need to cover. It's just a drain in the floor. So as long as we make sure that we have benchwork over it, it's not going to be in the way. For this second design, I drew a basic double track loop with a single track Y to a staging yard along the back wall of his basement, which would use up one shelf in all his storage units. Although I wasn't sure that he would accept that, I did want to throw it out there just so that we didn't leave a viable option on the table. The idea being that he would be able to have a good number of nice long trains staged, and he could run them around the loop in either direction through all his various scenes. And I suggested that there would probably be a small mini peninsula at some point with a few industries on it. Anyway, he wrote back and said that he did not want to reorganize his storage area, so this extension for the staging yard was out of the question. However, he did suggest that maybe we should extend the layout a few feet and go all the way to the end of his workbench. By this time, he had already removed the table and chairs from this area, so we now had an extra few feet of length to work with. Here is a design that I drew, revisiting the possibility of a folded dog bone, which was his first choice. And now we can see that with the extra distance we have to move this one end curve, it's feasible to bring the other one out to here and still have a fairly minimal aisle between them. Certainly not ideal, and such a layout would still be very tight in places. So we went back to the possibility of just an around the walls loop with a swing gate across the entrance. So here is that variation. And note that I didn't use the whole rectangle. That's because there is a water heater in this area. And although I could have come down here and there'd still be enough room to walk through, it didn't really gain us a lot. And I just felt it was much better to leave a wider walkway. So here is a plan with a basic double track loop. I've shown two switching areas and how a staging yard could be hidden behind a low backdrop along the long wall. Now the client had already informed me that he does have a topside creeper and he is perfectly okay with the long reaches over the deep benchwork. In fact, all his original designs included benchwork a lot deeper than this because he had 24-inch radius turn-back loops in the two corners with no opening in the table. So obviously that meant benchwork in excess of 4 feet deep in places. So even the depth of these scenes that I'm drawing are still a lot easier for him than what he had. And he was perfectly happy to have to bring the topside creeper in order to do maintenance in the staging yard. So this is one plan that I drew using this footprint. And then I drew another plan on 2 decks. This is the main deck showing the double track loop and a single track helix attached via a Y so you can get trains into it from both directions. And here is the lower deck. You come out of the Y, go through a big staging yard, across the swing gate again, and then to a reversing loop under the helix. And this plan has the benefit of a fairly large bonus scenic section. And since he wanted a wide variety of different kinds of scenery, this seemed like a really useful area because it would avoid any kind of awkward transitions between very dissimilar kinds of scenery in adjacent scenes. After a while, the client wrote back and said that although he liked this concept, he felt that the single deck layout was more in line with what he wanted to build. So we went back to this one and discussed what he liked about it and where he felt that it didn't quite provide what he was looking for. The biggest thing he didn't like about it was the fact that it was all on one level. He said he was hoping for a scene where one track could pass over another. So I suggested a twice round single track main line that crossed over itself at one point and probably crossing over a river as well at the same place, with part of the loop having the two main lines side by side so it would look like a double track and he would be able to see trains passing each other. And he wrote back and said he thought that might be just the ticket. So let's find the next one that I drew. In this drawing, I've shown the staging yard still in the existing position where it was. I've got a fairly good sized switching district in front of it. Now note that this is not intended to be a final design. I'm just drawing in what will fit. And I did make a note to the client that I wasn't necessarily suggesting that he include all the spurs. I just wanted to give an indication of how much it would be possible to fit in the space, and then we would be able to trim it back later as the plan progressed. The main feature of this plan being the twice round main, with part of it looking like double track and then the two tracks crossing over each other. A single multi-span bridge would cross over the lower track and the river at the same time, while the other track would parallel the river for some distance. Now he really liked this concept, but it turned out that there was some miscommunication earlier, and he didn't like the fact that it no longer had two independent loops. So he wasn't going to be able to just let two trains circle unattended in opposite directions. So we talked about various possibilities. The first suggestion was that we don't cross the loops over each other, we just have them completely separate rather than having the inner loop become the outer. That way it'd be two single track loops, one of which would pass through the staging yard and the other through the switching area, with a pair of crossovers to allow trains to get from one to the other. Now he didn't like that idea because he really wanted to keep the over-under arrangement, because he really saw the scenic potential of this area and he was really looking forward to being able to watch his trains pass over and under each other. And with the size of the loop we have, it didn't really seem that it was going to work well to have the tracks cross each other twice to make that arrangement work. So at the expense of adding track density, I suggested that we keep the inner single track loop and then make the other one an independent double track main line. So that is what I drew here. The two switching areas are identical, and once again, they're not intended to be final designs, just an idea of what's possible in the space. We can see that we have a double track loop continuing all the way around, running through staging, and a single track, let's call it the branch line. It comes off the inner main, crosses over it, and then joins back on the outer main, and we have a crossover between the two. Really, we should have two crossovers, although that one isn't totally vital. I did point out that with a double track through the staging yard, he needs to leave 2 tracks open for through running. So the 6-track yard now only stores 4 trains instead of 5. So I recommended that that be increased to 8 tracks, so you can store 3 in each direction, still leaving the run through. And at this point, the client felt that I had satisfied every requirement that he gave me. He really liked the concept. He didn't feel that he needed me to continue working on it, especially as he was on a fairly tight budget. He wanted to take it himself from here. So I just gave him one more drawing. He asked about elevations. So I worked out the ideal elevation changes. Note that it's not height from floor. I suggested that he just figured out what height was ideal for him and build it accordingly. I started with the track under the bridge at 0, make that my datum, and worked out everything from there. We need about 4 inches to cross over it, allowing plenty of space for the bridge deck. And then I just minimized the grades, and these are the numbers I came up with. Since he had reiterated just how much he liked bridges and would like to see lots of them, I suggested moving this crossover to a different point. It can either be a curved crossover in this corner or around here somewhere, or it can be moved on this straight and become a double crossover. That would leave room for an impressive double track truss bridge, such as the Walther's Humped Pratt truss bridge, which looks absolutely fabulous. And that would be the first scene that one would see when entering the train room. So I felt that it was a good suggestion to turn that into another bridge scene. So anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's a little unusual for me to present a partial layout design, but I felt that this is a good example of thinking outside the box to come up with a design which matches what a client wants when at the start of the project they're really not sure what they want. So anyway, the client is looking forward to getting on with his new layout, and I'm happy for him, and I hope that my viewers found something useful in this video. I'm going to sign off here, and I will see you back next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.